Hello and welcome to this first part of Miles Davis's Funky Abstractions. Now, by all accounts, Miles Davis was a pretty intimidating presence to be around, and his discography gives off the same kind of vibes too. There's at least 61 studio albums, I think 39 live albums, 26 box sets. He had periods like Picasso did, a massive body of work. It's a lot to take in, and it's difficult to know where to begin. Now, if you only know one Miles Davis album, it's probably A Kind of Blue. It's the biggest selling jazz album of all time. It's sold in excess of 4 million copies. It's chilled, tasteful, minimal in its approach to harmony and melody. It revolutionized jazz, slowed down the pace, emphasized the subtle over the bombastic. There's almost no similarity to the records he was making just about a decade later than that. And that's what this video is going to be about, Miles Davis's electric era. During this period, he used what jazz critics call rock rhythms, but which really have their roots in funk and soul. His band used increasing amounts of electric instruments and amplification, partly to deal with large venues. They started using effects units. The music got ever more abstract and earthy at the same time. Miles Davis's band had always constantly evolved, as did the concepts and structures he placed upon them. In the 60s, this eternally rotating band was the place to be for up-and-coming jazz musicians, whether live or more prized in the studio. He stole musicians on a regular basis. For example, he was no fan of the saxophonist, Charles Lloyd. Sorry, of course he is. He thought of him as a hack and a fraud, but he did like Charles Lloyd's rhythm section. He liked Charles Lloyd's drummers so much that he ended up stealing 3 of them over the years. All of those drummers can be heard at various points over these recordings that we're going to be covering, but not exclusively them. There's lots more people playing drums, percussion. Miles knew the textures, the sounds, the feel that he wanted, and dictated them all to his musicians in that threatening, mafiosi destroyed whisper of his. Musicians took to their tasks with deadly seriousness. He'd scowl at them for their note choices, calling them butter, too sweet, soft. He'd throw different musicians against each other and see what stuck. That was always Miles Davis's thing, creating musical and interpersonal situations. He'd create friction, which inspired himself and the other players. It kind of like sand in the Vaseline, as it were. It stopped things getting too comfortable at any point. In short, he bullied, cajoled his musicians into giving him their best performances. This style of management very much came from his father, Miles Davis Sr. Miles Davis Sr. was an overbearing man. He did not suffer fools at all. There's a famous story of him having chased, shotgun in hand, a white guy who'd racially abused Miles Jr. Miles Jr. was old enough at 45 to be the father of most of the musicians in his band. He treated them as his father had treated him, with a strong will and an undercurrent of threat and the threat of violence, essentially. Despite his Prince of Darkness shtick, Davis was apparently quite nurturing with a lot of his musicians at times. Rather than coldly firing them, he'd encourage them to get their own bands going, saying, "Isn't it time you made your own records?" The turnover, though, was always high. Some, like Joe Zaniwal, were invited to do further work with the band, but turned him down because they couldn't handle the feeling of brooding tension that always hung over everything. Through the 60s, he came to rely less on defined traditional song structures. With a kind of blue, the harmony had been treated in an abstract manner, and forms were stretched out, allowed to breathe. The movement in jazz during the 60s was away from traditional song structures as well, and Miles went with that flow. Unlike most jazz players of the time, he was open to trying new musical equipment, so he was very much a modernist in that sense, and I don't just mean with his immaculate hair and suit, but in the true sense. He loved wah-wah pedals, that new invention of the time. He used one for his trumpet, which is what they were originally invented for. He bought the rest of the band them and insisted that they all use them, well, aside for the drummers, because that's not possible. This philosophy of throwing confounding elements into the equation extended to the compositional process. Herbie Hancock and many other players talk of his philosophy that mistakes are legitimized by what comes after them. There are no wrong notes in that sense. It's all about context. The bands improvised for long sessions, and when they were in the studio, just about everything was recorded, even the breaks in between, just in case one of the players had an idea that they wanted to run with. The majority of the sessions from this period are collected on box sets, some of the 26 box sets that you can find by Miles Davis. I'd highly recommend them. There's a lot of music to get in there though. They're a comprehensive overview of a very fertile period. He carried on setting kind of musical puzzles for himself via the constantly changing band that he rehearsed with. But even this constant evolution, there were just too many things going on in the world of popular music for him to even hope to stay current and keep up in the sort of mid to late 60s. Miles Davis was, make no mistake, the hippest man in the world, or that is until the psychedelic hippie craze turned up, and it turned every notion of cool on its head. He'd always dressed well, impeccably, sharp suits since the day he could buy them with his sometimes ill-gotten gains. Incidentally, if anyone needs retrospectively cancelling for their attitudes and actions, it's Miles Davis. But I'll try and concentrate on the body of work rather than salacious details on here. His was the rebirth of cool. He dressed in preppy Brooks Brothers suits. He loved and was loved in Paris. He was the urbane epitome of the refined, sophisticated jazzman, but none of that was really cool by the late 60s. At the heart of all this was a feeling, I think, of being out of touch with the culture, which had turned day glow, tuned in, turned on, dropped out on one side, and on the other side was consumed with protests and riots. Truth be told, Miles Davis, he couldn't get a lock on what was going on with his fellow black people. He spoke many times in interviews about wanting to connect with them, the ones in the street, the ones protesting. He was in his brownstone house getting high with models. Miles had grown up rich, the kind of upper middle class that having a dental surgeon for a father provides. He grew up with a second home in a different state with 200 acres of land and horses. He was that kind of rich. In my opinion, the hyper-masculine image he constructed for boxing, the mean glare, and I think partly this was inherited from his father and partly was a coping mechanism for social isolation. Being rich but black in a world ruled by white men would have been something of a lonely kind of liminal space, I imagine, in any case, from this distance. He grew up rich and was richer now by far. how could he even start to empathise with the struggle of the people? He's spoken in interviews about how he felt a separation from the mainstream of black society while growing up. This didn't mean he was at the level of what a white man would be at that time, which made him completely isolated. On top of this, jazz had stopped being a fashionable form. People had stopped caring about the newest developments in jazz. They'd stopped caring about Miles. His band had acted as a launch pad for many of the young hotshots on the jazz on the jazz scene over the last few years. That's to say the mid-1960s. Now, jazz critics love that era, which they call his second great quintet. But the era of acoustic music had effectively ended when Bob Dylan plugged his Telecaster in and pledged to play fucking loud. People had stopped caring so much about jazz then. They'd stopped caring about what Miles Davis was up to, and this wasn't something Miles Davis liked. Rock, the era of exploration in popular culture at that time, was all about amplification, distortion, studio trickery. It was a world away from the sound world of A Kind of Blue, that pristine document of a band in a room. Then there were the clothes. Black and white people were growing their hair. The clothes were looser, more colourful. Miles looked out of touch. He looked buttoned up, he needed to get with it. Now his young new wife, Betty Davis, nee Maybury, was an influence in all this. She kind of kept him a bit in touch in the short time that they were together with what was going on in youth culture. She was a musician and a model. She had a song on an album by the Chambers Brothers, who you may know if you like sort of like West Coast psych. She was also the model on the cover of Files de Kilimanjaro, which and in a few national magazines as well. So she was successful at a number of things. In her time with Miles, she made some. After her time with Miles, she made some really top-notch, down and dirty funk albums. She'd been socialising, networking in bars and clubs since the early 60s, singing sometimes as a selector choosing the records. She had good taste. She introduced Miles to a lot of the sonic kind of flavours and foundation for his next stage. Some of what she turned him on to was the music of people she knew. She was a friend of Sly Stone, Jimi Hendrix. Miles locked onto the both of them, their music especially. Funk rhythm spoke to him. This is what the people on the streets were listening to. That beat, James Brown did it even better. Tony Williams was a great drummer, but he flew around the kit. This was music that demanded a feel, a pocket overall. Funk taught Miles the benefit of the 3 R's: repetition, repetition, and repetition. So it's no understatement that the music of James Brown revolutionised pop, soul, funk, whatever you want to call it, from the mid-1960s onwards. In his music, every instrument, even the vocals, are a form of percussion. Composition was treated differently. Grooves were allowed to play out and evolve for as long as was necessary. And jazz was originally dance music, as funk had now become the dance music of the people. It had taken back place in the popular, mainly black public consciousness. Of course, music that derived from rhythm rather than classical concepts of harmony and melody was nothing new. Globally speaking, the tablas of India and percussive ensembles of South America are 2 examples of music which explores polyrhythms. Miles listened to all this, and over the next few years he incorporated those rhythms and textures into his music as well. From Hendrix, he took a whole new palette of sounds. These the records of Jimi Hendrix didn't just sound like some guys in a room playing. The sound echoed and flew from speaker to speaker, and then from behind your head with phase tricks. In Hendrix's records, there are no real rules. Things could be inside out. It could be a guitar being mangled, or it could be tape trickery. Ted Maceo was the person that could help Miles with this. He produced most of his Columbia records. He'd kind of fallen into record production through the 1950s, setting up sessions, booking the musicians, making sure all the microphones were set up correctly, directing the engineers. He knew how to splice tape. This new idea of editing together takes to create whole new compositions was essentially Miles' idea, but the execution was Maceo and his small staff of engineers. In fact, truth be told, it's questionable how much input Miles actually had into the post-production, apart from a couple of listening sessions that are documented. In later years, Maceo went on to kind of boast that he'd done the vast majority of the actual editing and post-production work, that he had carte blanche. He also says that Miles only entered the editing room 4 or 5 times during the whole of the recording of the electric period. For his part, Miles kept his distance from the producer. Not only was he whitey, but he was a corporation employee, a handler sent by the company that he was contracted to. As far as Miles was concerned, the music was of his own invention. He took mixed sections home and let a stopwatch play as he noted down the final construction of what he wanted the piece to be. So the beginning from here, a middle section from here, and the end from here. So who was actually in charge of things? Well, probably the truth is somewhere between Miles and Maceo. They were acting together like producer and director would in a film. Without Maceo, Miles would not have been able to make those great leaps forward and, the whole new worlds of sound that these records, in my opinion, made. So personal animosity aside, they stuck to their roles and had an ultimately productive working career. It could be said that with his hands-off yet forceful and antagonistic style of management towards Maceo, Miles again was throwing a little friction in the mix. Another confounding variable to kind of keep things lively. Okay, so the Hendrix influence came through subtly at first in Ms. Mabry from Files de Kilimanjaro. It's both a homage to Hendrix and named for his wife's Betty's maiden name, Mabry. For that tune, Miles borrowed the tender chromatic turnaround from The Wind Cries Mary and built a slinky, low-key kind of sexy track around it. On that album we started to use electric instruments, bass, keyboards, but it was with the next that the electric period would truly begin. Okay, so that's it for the first video. We've taken it to the birth of the electric period, essentially. Thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to like and subscribe, share, all that business, and thank you very much. Goodbye.